What if a courtroom didn't just decide guilt or innocence, but life and death? That's the haunting reality we step into tonight. A young man, 22 years old, sits in silence. He refuses to speak, refuses to confess, refuses to beg. Across from him, grieving families sit, waiting for justice. And then the words drop like a hammer, death sentence. But why? Why did the court take the ultimate step, one so rare in Utah that it immediately raised eyebrows across the nation? And what was the reasoning so shocking, so controversial, that it turned a straightforward murder case into a national firestorm? We begin where all stories of tragedy begin. At the moment, everything changed. Picture it, a warm Wednesday in Orem, Utah. An open-air event at Utah Valley University. The crowd buzzing with energy. Charlie Kirk, just 31 years old, a political activist known for his fiery speeches and his work co-founding Turning Point USA, takes the stage. His supporters lean forward, his critics cross their arms, and the atmosphere crackles with tension. No one expects the next few minutes will end in chaos. No one expects the next few minutes will end in death. But that's exactly what happened. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The sharp crack of a rifle, the screams that followed, the scrambling of hundreds of feet as people fled for their lives. Kirk collapses on stage, the target of a cold, calculated attack. Tyler Robinson, a man barely out of his teenage years, becomes the central figure in a nightmare. But let's stop here and ask the question: how does a young man become the alleged assassin of one of the most polarizing right-wing figures in America? Was it political anger, personal vendetta, or something deeper, something hidden that only investigators would eventually uncover? From the very beginning, this case was soaked in suspicion. Investigators quickly closed in on Robinson, but not because of eyewitness accounts. Not because someone pointed a finger and said, "That's the shooter." No, it was science, DNA, that drew a straight line from the crime scene to the man in custody. On a rooftop near the event, a screwdriver lay abandoned. On the weapon used to fire the fatal shots, a towel was found, wrapped around the rifle as if to hide fingerprints. Both were tested. Both told the same story. Tyler Robinson was there. Tyler Robinson touched them. When FBI Director Kash Patel went on national television to confirm these DNA hits, the case seemed sealed. His words carried the weight of authority. The DNA hits from the towel that was wrapped around the firearm and the DNA on the screwdriver are positively processed for the suspect in custody. It was a statement designed not just to inform the public, but to reassure them. The killer had been caught. Justice was on its way. But here's the twist. Robinson said nothing. From the moment of his arrest, through every interrogation, through every court appearance, he sat stone-faced. No confession. No apology, no explanation. Imagine the frustration of investigators, the anger of grieving families, the confusion of a nation watching. Why was he silent? Was it arrogance? Was it strategy? Or was it fear? Now let's zoom out. In Utah, aggravated murder carries one of the most extreme possible punishments, the death penalty. But that doesn't mean it's often given. In fact, death sentences are rare, controversial, and intensely scrutinized. Prosecutors have to prove not just guilt, but aggravating circumstances. Cold-blooded planning. Ruthlessness. A crime so shocking it demands the ultimate consequence. And in this case, the prosecution had plenty to work with. A public figure gunned down in broad daylight. A community terrorized. Evidence suggesting preparation, calculation, intent. Every detail painted a portrait of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care who suffered. Still, the decision was not simple. Inside that courtroom, legal teams clashed in a battle of narrative. The prosecution spoke of a man who had executed an assassination. The defense painted a different picture of a young man, misunderstood, possibly unstable, whose silence might hint at mental illness rather than guilt. Which version do you believe? Which version would you want a jury to believe if you were sitting in that room? This is where the real tension lies. Justice versus mercy. Punishment versus rehabilitation. Life versus death. But there's another layer. Governor Spencer Cox stepped into the public debate early, stating that the suspect was not cooperating and had not confessed. A governor making such strong remarks during an ongoing case is unusual. Was it political pressure? Was it a move to shape public perception? Or was it simply frustration boiling over? His words added fuel to the fire, transforming a courtroom drama into a national talking point. Let's pause for a second. Think about it. How do you feel about the death penalty? Do you believe it's justice? Or do you believe it's revenge dressed up in legal clothing? That's the very debate this trial forced into the open. Because when the judge delivered the death sentence, it wasn't just about Tyler Robinson. It was about what kind of justice system we want in America. And yet, we circle back to the haunting question, why? What made this case different? What convinced the court that nothing short of death would suffice? Was it the political nature of the crime? The public setting? The cold evidence? Or something else entirely? Something that hasn't been fully revealed to the public? Here's where things get truly chilling. Reports suggest that behind the sentencing decision lay a reasoning so severe, so unsettling, that even seasoned legal analysts were left speechless. It wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about what those actions symbolized, what they risked unleashing if left unchecked. But before we uncover that hidden reason, we need to walk through the trial itself. The witnesses who shook the courtroom. The evidence that silenced the defense. The moment the jury's faces changed when they saw what prosecutors revealed. Each step brings us closer to the verdict, closer to the unveiling of the reason, closer to the chilling conclusion that shocked the world. And here's where I leave you, at the edge of that revelation. Because the courtroom story didn't end with the gavel. In fact, that's where it truly began. The judge's words were chilling. The reason was controversial. And what came next would change everything. The air was thick with anticipation. Students, supporters, critics, and the merely curious had gathered at Utah Valley University for what was supposed to be a spirited but safe political rally. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that feels uneventful until history decides otherwise. Charlie Kirk, 31 years old, known for his brash energy and uncompromising political positions, was the main attraction. People leaned forward in their seats, phones poised in their hands, waiting for soundbites, applause lines, and maybe even controversy. Nobody in that crowd knew that within minutes, their lives would be defined by the echo of a gunshot. The stage was set under a crisp sky. Flags fluttered in the breeze. The open-air platform gave the moment a sense of freedom and openness, as if democracy itself was on display. Kirk stepped forward, his voice booming through the microphone. He had done this countless times before. Thousands of speeches across the country, dozens of campuses, endless debates. To him, this was routine. To the audience, this was electricity. Some came to cheer, others to protest, but all came expecting words. What they got instead was silence interrupted by terror. Imagine the scene, laughter cutting short into screams. The warm late afternoon light suddenly feels cold as shadows stretch across panicked faces. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle rips through the air. People duck, scatter, trip over each other. Phones drop. Shoes are lost. Bags are abandoned. In less than a heartbeat, the open-air celebration turns into chaos. Charlie Kirk staggers, his words cut off mid-sentence. For a moment, there's confusion. Was it fireworks, some kind of disruption, a prank? But the truth settles faster than anyone can process. Kirk collapses, and the stage is no longer a stage. It is a crime scene. Have you ever wondered how fragile life really is? How a single second, one pull of a trigger, can redraw the lines of history? That's what the people in Orem, Utah, felt that day. They weren't just witnesses. They were survivors of a political assassination played out in front of their eyes. Police sirens wailed almost instantly. Officers rushed the scene, securing the area, pushing people back, trying to bring order to disorder. But for many in that crowd, the sound of sirens only deepened the panic. Parents screamed for their children. Students called their families. Reporters who had come for sound bites suddenly found themselves reporting history as it unfolded, their voices shaking as they described the unthinkable, a political figure gunned down at a university event. Let's pause here and think. How does something like this happen in America, in broad daylight, at a university? How does a man with a rifle position himself with such precision, such confidence, and pull off an act like this? Was it madness, or was it meticulous planning? That's the question investigators would be forced to answer in the days that followed. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a man was lying on the stage, motionless. A crowd that had gathered to debate politics was now running for its life. And somewhere nearby, the man accused of pulling the trigger, 22-year-old Tyler Robinson, was vanishing into the background, slipping away like a shadow. As the dust settled, the first images began to circulate. Grainy cell phone videos flooded social media. Screams, chaos, people crying out for help, shared millions of times within hours. News stations cut into regular programming. The name, Charlie Kirk, trended worldwide, but this time not for his controversial speeches. This time, it was for the unthinkable assassination. Inside the panic, there were heroes. First responders rushed to Kirk, attempting life-saving measures. Students helped guide the wounded out of the crowd. Strangers pulled others to safety. These small acts of humanity stood in stark contrast to the violence that had erupted, a reminder that even in darkness, light can flicker. But while the nation reeled, investigators were already piecing together the puzzle. Shell casings, footprints, and abandoned items littered the rooftop where the shooter had taken his position. And among those items was the clue that would unravel everything. A screwdriver and a towel. Ordinary objects, discarded carelessly, but destined to become extraordinary evidence. Think about that for a second. A towel, something as mundane as what you dry your hands with. A screwdriver, something you might find in any garage. And yet, in this story, they weren't ordinary at all. They carried traces of DNA. They carried the fingerprints of guilt. They pointed directly to one man. But before that revelation would rock the case wide open, the immediate aftermath told its own story. Students interviewed outside the university spoke through tears. "I thought it was fireworks," one said. "Then I saw him fall." Another voice cracked as they said, "I'll never forget the sound." The governor's office released a statement that night, condemning the violence, pledging justice, and acknowledging the fear that had gripped the state. It wasn't just about one man's death anymore. It was about whether any public figure was safe, whether any stage was untouchable, whether politics had crossed a line from words to weapons. And let's not ignore the symbolism here. A university, the supposed marketplace of ideas, became the scene of deadly silence. A political rally, meant for speech, ended in gunfire. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. America has always prided itself on freedom of expression. But when expression is silenced by a bullet, what happens then? Now imagine being in that courtroom later, watching as prosecutors played back those videos, showing jurors the fear etched into the faces of hundreds of people. Imagine being a juror, tasked with deciding the fate of the man accused of turning that sunny day into a nightmare. Could you ever forget what you saw? Could you ever forgive what you heard? That's the power of this first chapter, the day everything changed. The shooting wasn't just an act of violence. It was a moment that forced America to look in the mirror and ask, what have we become? And yet, this was only the beginning. Because while the world watched the chaos unfold, behind the scenes, investigators were piecing together a chilling trail of evidence that would lead directly to Tyler Robinson. DNA, abandoned tools, and silence, his silence, would all come together to form a story the courtroom could not ignore. But before the world heard about DNA matches in courtrooms, there was only that day. That shocking day. The day a voice was silenced by a bullet. And as night fell over Utah, one thing became clear. This was no random act of violence. This was something far more deliberate. But just how deliberate? And what investigators uncovered next would send the case spiraling into a battle over life and death itself. Who was he? That's the question everyone asked as soon as his name was released to the public. Tyler Robinson, 22 years old, barely into adulthood. And yet, he was accused of carrying out one of the most chilling acts of political violence in recent memory. The name didn't ring a bell for most Americans. He wasn't a public figure, he wasn't known in political circles, and he didn't have a history that made headlines. But in one moment, his identity was broadcast across every screen in America. He wasn't just a name anymore. He was the man behind the trigger. Let's strip away the headlines for a moment and ask the deeper question. What makes a person like Tyler Robinson? How does an ordinary young man become the center of a murder trial, facing the possibility of the death penalty? Was it ideology? Was it mental instability? Or was it something far more personal, a spark of resentment that turned into a wildfire? Tyler Robinson grew up in Utah, far from the world of political fame and controversy that Charlie Kirk inhabited. His early years were described by classmates and neighbors as unremarkable. Quiet, some said. Kept to himself. Others remembered flashes of anger, moments where his temper seemed just a little too sharp, a little too uncontrolled. But none of them could have predicted he would someday be accused of pulling a trigger on a national stage. Have you noticed how often, after these kinds of tragedies, people look back and try to piece together a pattern? It's as if society is desperate to find an answer, to point to something and say, that's why it happened. A broken home, a difficult childhood, social isolation, a fascination with weapons. And in Robinson's case, all of these whispers floated in the background. But whispers aren't proof. What we know for certain is this: Robinson wasn't a stranger to Utah Valley University. Investigators later learned he had been on campus before, blending in, watching, preparing. The rooftop where the DNA evidence was found wasn't chosen at random. He knew the layout. He knew where to position himself. That's not the behavior of someone who snapped in a moment of madness. That's the behavior of someone who planned. Planning is what separates impulsive acts from premeditated ones. And in the eyes of the law, that distinction is everything. Aggravated murder requires proof of intent, proof of forethought, proof that the killer meant to do what they did. Tyler Robinson's alleged steps: choosing a rooftop, bringing tools, wrapping a towel around a rifle, painted a picture of intent so clear it was impossible to ignore. But let's look at his silence. From the moment he was arrested, Robinson said nothing. No confession, no plea of innocence, no apology, just silence. Doesn't that make you wonder? Was it arrogance, an unshakable belief that he had nothing to explain? Or was it strategy, a legal move to avoid self-incrimination? Some even speculated it was fear, that maybe Robinson knew something bigger was at play, something that kept him from speaking out. The courtroom became a stage for this silence. Prosecutors painted it as callousness. Look at him, they argued. He shows no remorse. He shows no humanity. He refuses to acknowledge what he's done. The defense countered with a different narrative. Silence doesn't prove guilt. Silence could be the symptom of trauma, mental illness, or shock. Which interpretation do you believe? And here's where the story twists even further. In the weeks before the shooting, Robinson's online presence came under scrutiny. Investigators scoured his social media, his digital footprints, searching for a motive. Some claimed to find posts hinting at political resentment. Others pointed to darker corners of the internet, forums where anger festers into ideology. But the question remained: was Robinson driven by politics? Or was politics just the stage on which his personal demons played out? Let's not forget the human side of this story. Tyler Robinson wasn't just a suspect. He was a son. He had parents, friends, people who once sat beside him in class. For them, the shock was unbearable. "I can't believe it," one former teacher said. "That's not the Tyler I knew." Another former classmate admitted, "He always seemed intense, but this? No one saw this coming." But that's the thing, isn't it? Tragedies like this rarely make sense in hindsight. The pieces never fit neatly together. And maybe that's why people cling so tightly to the narrative prosecutors create in the courtroom. They need a story that explains the inexplicable. The irony in this case is staggering. A young man, just barely older than the students who ran screaming that day, accused of taking the life of someone he'd probably never even met personally. Their worlds collided in one moment of violence, and nothing would ever be the same. But the chilling part is this: Robinson wasn't caught because of what he said or did afterward. He was caught because of what he left behind. His silence was loud, but his DNA was louder. A towel, a screwdriver, objects abandoned in haste, carrying microscopic fingerprints of truth. That was the trap he couldn't escape. Still, the question lingers: what was his motive? Why Charlie Kirk? Why that day, that stage, that rally? Was it an attack on a man, or was it an attack on an idea? And did Robinson act alone, or was he part of something bigger, something darker? Prosecutors would later argue that motive almost didn't matter. "You don't need to know why he did it to know that he did it," they told the jury. But for the public, for the grieving families, for the millions watching, motive matters. Without it, the story feels unfinished. Without it, justice feels incomplete. And that's where this chapter leaves us, on the edge of that unanswered question. Who was Tyler Robinson? Was he a political assassin, a troubled young man, or a pawn in something larger. Because what happened next, what investigators found, what prosecutors revealed, would paint an even more chilling picture of just how deliberate this crime truly was. And it all comes down to the evidence. The DNA, the science that would trap Robinson in a web he could not escape. What if the strongest witness in a courtroom isn't a person at all? Not a trembling voice recounting what they saw, not a neighbor pointing to the accused, but something far smaller, far colder, far more unforgiving. DNA, invisible to the naked eye, yet louder than any words could ever be. In the case of Tyler Robinson, accused of gunning down Charlie Kirk in front of a horrified crowd at Utah Valley University, it wasn't a confession that sealed the narrative. It wasn't eyewitnesses pointing fingers. It was science, microscopic, irrefutable, and damning. From the very beginning, investigators knew they had to move fast. The scene of the crime was chaotic. Hundreds of people screaming, running, scattering. Evidence was trampled underfoot. The possibility of contamination loomed. But in the middle of that chaos, they found a trail, and that trail led them upward, to the rooftop that gave the shooter his deadly vantage point. On that rooftop, they discovered something almost ordinary. A screwdriver, tossed aside. A dark-colored towel, crumpled and forgotten. To the untrained eye, these were scraps, nothing more. But to forensic investigators, they were treasure. Because those items didn't just tell a story of preparation, they carried the shooter's very identity. And here's where science takes the stage. Forensic specialists carefully collected the items, sealing them in evidence bags, treating them like gold. Underneath harsh lab lights, the towel revealed what every criminal fears: traces of human DNA, sweat, skin cells, microscopic pieces of a life that could not be erased. The screwdriver told the same story, its handle carrying traces of biological material left behind in haste. Think about it. Tyler Robinson may have believed that wrapping the rifle in a towel would hide his fingerprints. He may have thought abandoning tools would erase his tracks. But the truth? The very things he left behind became his undoing. The towel wasn't protection, it was evidence. The screwdriver wasn't forgotten. It was a confession written in code, waiting for scientists to translate. When the FBI tested those samples, the results came back crystal clear. A positive hit. Tyler Robinson's DNA was there. His biological fingerprint was stamped onto the tools of the crime. FBI Director Kash Patel went public with the findings, announcing on national television. The DNA hits from the towel that was wrapped around the firearm and the DNA on the screwdriver are positively processed for the suspect in custody. Do you realize the weight of those words? This wasn't speculation. This wasn't a witness misremembering. This wasn't shaky footage from a cell phone. This was science saying, he was there. But let's dig deeper. Why is DNA so powerful in the courtroom? It's because, unlike humans, DNA doesn't lie. Eyewitnesses can falter. Memories can blur. People can be swayed by fear, by bias, by pressure. But DNA is impartial. If your genetic code is there, science will find it. That's why prosecutors love DNA evidence, and that's why defense attorneys fear it. Now, here's where things get truly dramatic. The defense tried to downplay the evidence. They argued about contamination, about the possibility of secondary transfer. They suggested maybe Robinson's DNA was on those items because he had touched them at some other time, in some other place. But think about that. A screwdriver found on a rooftop near the crime scene. A towel wrapped around the murder weapon. How else could his DNA have ended up there? The argument stretched credibility, and the jury knew it. But DNA wasn't the only evidence. It was part of a mosaic. Ballistics tied the rifle to the crime. Surveillance footage placed Robinson near the area before the shooting. But the DNA, the DNA was the thread that stitched everything together. Without it, maybe the defense could have argued doubt. With it, doubt evaporated. And here's the irony. Tyler Robinson never spoke a word. He never confessed. He never explained himself. He thought his silence would protect him. But while he said nothing, his body screamed the truth. His DNA told the story he refused to tell. Pause for a moment and consider the emotional weight of this for Charlie Kirk's family, for the supporters who watched him fall, for the jurors who had to sit through every gruesome detail. That towel and that screwdriver weren't just objects. They were smoking guns. They were the invisible fingerprints of guilt. They carried the undeniable presence of the man who tried so hard to vanish into silence. And yet, as powerful as the DNA evidence was, it also raised new questions. Did Robinson act alone? Were others involved in planning the attack? If so, why was his DNA the only one found on those critical items? Or was this proof that he, and he alone, was the mastermind, the planner, the executioner? It's here that we encounter a contradiction that gnawed at both investigators and the public. On one hand, the evidence screamed premeditation. On the other, Robinson's silence created a vacuum. Without words, without confession, motive remained a mystery. And in a courtroom, motive matters, not always to secure a conviction, but to satisfy the human need for answers. The prosecution argued that motive was irrelevant. They had proof he was there, proof he handled the murder weapon, proof he abandoned the tools. What more was needed? But the defense clung to the lack of confession, the lack of direct motive, painting the picture of a young man misunderstood, perhaps mentally ill, perhaps incapable of fully grasping his actions. And that's the irony of this chapter. DNA is absolute in science, but it is interpreted in the theater of the courtroom. The towel didn't say guilty. The screwdriver didn't say, I killed Charlie Kirk. It was the prosecution who gave those objects a voice, who translated the science into a narrative of guilt. Still, when jurors looked at those lab reports, when they saw the charts and graphs and heard the experts testify, the conclusion was unavoidable. Science had spoken. Tyler Robinson was there. He handled the tools of death. He wrapped the murder weapon. He left behind the proof that would seal his fate. But here's the chilling part. While DNA proved his presence, it couldn't explain his silence. It couldn't answer the why. It couldn't reveal the inner workings of a man who sat stone-faced in court, refusing to speak. And that gap between evidence and motive created a tension that would explode as the trial unfolded. Because DNA may have changed everything in terms of proof, but it didn't change the hunger for answers. It didn't change the need to know what was going through Tyler Robinson's mind when he pulled the trigger. And it didn't change the haunting fact that justice was now barreling toward a verdict of life or death. And that verdict, that choice, would not come down to science alone. It would come down to the drama of the courtroom, the power of testimony, the clash of arguments that would define whether Tyler Robinson lived or died. But before we get to the verdict, before we hear the gavel fall, we need to step into that courtroom and witness the drama unfold. Because what happened next, the courtroom battle, the fiery words of the prosecution, the desperate pleas of the defense, would be nothing short of explosive. The courtroom is a stage. Every word, every glance, every pause is part of a performance, one where the stakes are higher than anywhere else on earth. In this case, the curtains opened on a drama unlike any Utah courtroom had seen in years. On one side sat Tyler Robinson, the accused, a young man of just 22. Silent, expressionless. On the other sat the prosecution, armed with evidence, determined to prove that the assassination of Charlie Kirk was not only deliberate, but so heinous it deserved the ultimate punishment, death. From the very first moment, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was electric. Rows of journalists filled the benches, their pens scribbling, their cameras waiting for any flicker of emotion. Family members of Charlie Kirk sat close to the front, grief etched into their faces. Supporters filled the gallery, some whispering prayers, others holding back tears. And then, of course, there was Robinson, dressed in a plain suit, hair neatly combed, hands folded in front of him. He looked like any other young man you might pass on the street. And yet, the weight of his presence silenced the room. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time. Their opening statement was a storm, passionate, direct, unforgettable. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lead prosecutor thundered, you will see evidence that Tyler Robinson carefully, deliberately, and mercilessly planned the assassination of Charlie Kirk. He climbed a rooftop. He prepared his weapon. He waited for his target. And in one cold, calculated moment, he fired the shot that ended a life and terrorized a community. The words hit like blows. Every sentence crafted to frame Robinson not just as guilty, but as dangerous. The prosecutor leaned into the silence Robinson had maintained since his arrest. He refuses to speak. He refuses to explain. He refuses to acknowledge the pain he has caused. But the DNA speaks for him. The evidence speaks for him. And by the end of this trial, You will see that justice demands the harshest penalty allowed by law. Can you imagine sitting in that jury box, hearing those words? How would you feel, knowing that the decision you make could determine whether another human being lives or dies? Then came the defense. Their opening was not thunder, but a cold, calculated whisper. The lead defense attorney rose, buttoned his jacket, and spoke softly. My client is accused of a crime so terrible that emotions will run high in this courtroom. But your duty, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is not to give in to emotion. Your duty is to look at the facts, to see the gaps, to recognize the doubt. Yes, DNA was found on items near the scene. But does that prove he fired the weapon? Does that prove he intended to kill? Or does it simply prove he was there, in some capacity we may never fully understand? The defense leaned heavily into Robinson's silence, reframing it not as guilt, but as mystery. My client has not confessed. He has not admitted guilt. He has not even been proven to have fired that rifle. You must remember that silence is not evidence. And you must not allow anger, or fear, or grief to blind you to the possibility that this young man's life should not be taken based on assumption. Two narratives, two performances, one framing Robinson as a cold-blooded assassin, the other painting him as a silent enigma, perhaps misunderstood, perhaps wrongly accused. But the most striking part of those early days wasn't the words of the lawyers. It was Robinson himself. He sat still, barely blinking, his face unreadable. Was it indifference? Was it shock? Or was it, as some whispered, a chilling lack of remorse? The jurors noticed. The families noticed. The world noticed. And every news headline seized upon it. Silent suspect shows no emotion in court. The trial then moved into testimony. Witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the terror of that day at Utah Valley University. One student described hearing the shot. At first, I thought it was fireworks. Then I saw him fall. Another spoke through tears. I'll never forget the screams, the way everyone was just running. It didn't feel real. Each testimony painted a picture of chaos. Each voice pulled the jurors deeper into the horror of that afternoon. But the defense cross-examined with precision. Did you see my client pull the trigger? They asked, over and over again. Did you actually see him on that rooftop? Witness after witness admitted they had not. They had seen the chaos, the fear, the aftermath, but not Robinson himself. The defense was building its wall. No direct eyewitness, no direct confirmation. But here's the thing. The jury didn't need eyewitnesses. They had DNA, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The prosecution called forensic experts to the stand. Men and women in lab coats, armed with charts, graphs, and scientific authority. They explained how DNA was collected, how it was tested, how it matched Robinson beyond any reasonable doubt. The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone else, one expert testified, is less than 1 in a trillion. Can you feel the weight of that? 1 in a trillion. Against odds like that, what chance did the defense really have? Yet the defense tried. They questioned the chain of custody. They suggested contamination. They floated the possibility that Robinson's DNA had been planted. But jurors aren't scientists, they're human beings. And human beings trust science when it sounds this precise, this irrefutable. Still, the drama of the courtroom wasn't just about facts. It was about emotion. Family members of Charlie Kirk broke down on the stand, recounting the devastation of losing a son, a brother, a leader. Their tears weren't evidence, but they were powerful. They reminded everyone in that room that this wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning for a shattered family. And then there was the tension, unspoken but heavy, around the death penalty itself. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably whenever it was mentioned. Some avoided Robinson's gaze. Others stared at him, as if trying to read his soul. Could they do it? Could they really sentence a man to death? The opening days of the trial were a collision of science, testimony, and raw emotion. Every moment pushed the jury closer to a decision, closer to a verdict that would decide not only guilt but punishment. And yet, the most explosive moments were still to come. Because the courtroom hadn't yet heard the most shocking witness testimony. They hadn't yet faced the silence of Robinson himself. They hadn't yet seen the prosecution's final blow. And when those moments arrived, they would shake the courtroom to its core. Because what happened next wasn't just testimony, it was revelation. and no one in that room was prepared for what they were about to hear. When the prosecution began calling eyewitnesses to the stand, the courtroom seemed to shift. Suddenly, it wasn't charts, DNA reports, or legal arguments. It was raw, human voices reliving a nightmare. These weren't scientists or experts speaking in clinical terms. These were ordinary people, students, parents, bystanders, who had been there on that Wednesday afternoon at Utah Valley University when the crack of a rifle tore through the air. Their testimony wasn't about probabilities or chain of custody. It was about fear, chaos, and trauma. And it hit the jury like a thunderclap. The first eyewitness was a sophomore named Megan, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. "I was sitting maybe 20 feet from the stage," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Charlie Kirk had just started talking about free speech on campuses. And then it sounded like fireworks. Just one loud bang. At first, I didn't even realize what it was. But then I saw him fall, and people started screaming." She paused, wiping her eyes, the memory too sharp to hide. "I ran. Everyone was running. People were falling, pushing. I thought I was going to die." You could hear the gasps from the gallery. The jury leaned forward. Some glanced at Robinson, others avoided his face entirely. The defense attorney rose slowly. "Megan," he said gently, "thank you for your bravery. But let me ask, did you see who fired the shot?" Her answer was quick. "No, I didn't see." And just like that, the defense began carving cracks into the emotional testimony. They knew that pain moves hearts, but facts sway verdicts. The next eyewitness was different. A young man named Daniel, a first-year student, claimed he had seen something more. "I was near the back of the crowd," he said nervously. "When the shot rang out, I looked up. I saw someone on the rooftop." The courtroom froze. Someone on the rooftop. Could this be the direct link the prosecution needed? "Can you describe the person?" the prosecutor asked, almost breathless. Daniel nodded, but hesitated. "It was fast, but I saw a figure. Male, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see his face." The prosecutor pushed harder. "Did you recognize the man as the defendant, Tyler Robinson?" Silence. Daniel's eyes darted toward Robinson, who sat still, hands folded, staring straight ahead. Finally, Daniel shook his head. "No, I can't say for sure it was him. I just saw a shadow. That's all." The defense pounced. "So, you cannot identify my client. You cannot say it was him on that rooftop, correct?" Daniel's voice cracked. "Correct." The momentum seemed to slip for the prosecution. The eyewitnesses could paint the horror, but none could paint Robinson directly into the scene. And then came the most gut-wrenching testimony, the voice of a mother. She had been in the audience with her teenage son. Her hands shook as she gripped the stand. "I pulled him down when I heard the shot. I laid on top of him. I thought we were going to die right there." Her son, sitting in the gallery, wiped his eyes as she spoke. The prosecutor's questions were simple. "What did you feel in that moment?" Her answer broke the room. "Helpless, terrified, and angry. Angry that someone could do this at a school, in front of children, in front of everyone." Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Tears filled the eyes of Kirk's family. For a moment, the trial wasn't about law. It was about humanity. But once again, the defense cut through. "Did you see who fired the weapon?" "No," she admitted, voice cracking. Each testimony followed a rhythm. Trauma, chaos, pain, followed by the defense drilling down to the same point. No one actually saw Robinson pull the trigger. And yet, the accumulation of these voices did something powerful. They created a vivid picture of what happened that day, a picture the jury could not ignore. The terror, the screams, the stampede, all of it reinforced the prosecution's narrative of premeditation and public endangerment. But then came a twist. A security guard from the university took the stand. He testified that he had been among the first to reach the rooftop after the shooting. "I saw the towel. I saw the screwdriver. I saw the spot where the shooter had been positioned." The trial then moved into testimony. Witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the terror of that day at Utah Valley University. One student described hearing the shot. "At first, I thought it was fireworks. Then I saw him fall." Another spoke through tears. "I'll never forget the screams, the way everyone was just running. It didn't feel real." Each testimony painted a picture of chaos. Each voice pulled the jurors deeper into the horror of that afternoon. But the defense cross-examined with precision. "Did you see my client pull the trigger?" they asked, over and over again. "Did you actually see him on that rooftop?" Witness after witness admitted they had not. They had seen the chaos, the fear, the aftermath, but not Robinson himself. The defense was building its wall. No direct eyewitness, no direct confirmation. But here's the thing. The jury didn't need eyewitnesses. They had DNA, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The prosecution called forensic experts to the stand. Men and women in lab coats, armed with charts, graphs, and scientific authority. They explained how DNA was collected, how it was tested, how it matched Robinson beyond any reasonable doubt. "The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone else," one expert testified, "is less than 1 in a trillion. Can you feel the weight of that? 1 in a trillion. Against odds like that, what chance did the defense really have? Yet the defense tried. They questioned the chain of custody. They suggested contamination. They floated the possibility that Robinson's DNA had been planted. But jurors aren't scientists, they're human beings. And human beings trust science when it sounds this precise, this irrefutable. Still, the drama of the courtroom wasn't just about facts. It was about emotion. Family members of Charlie Kirk broke down on the stand, recounting the devastation of losing a son, a brother, a leader. Their tears weren't evidence, but they were powerful. They reminded everyone in that room that this wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning for a shattered family. And then there was the tension, unspoken but heavy, around the death penalty itself. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably whenever it was mentioned. Some avoided Robinson's gaze. Others stared at him, as if trying to read his soul. Could they do it? Could they really sentence a man to death? The opening days of the trial were a collision of science, testimony, and raw emotion. Every moment pushed the jury closer to a decision, closer to a verdict that would decide not only guilt but punishment. And yet, the most explosive moments were still to come. Because the courtroom hadn't yet heard the most shocking witness testimony. They hadn't yet faced the silence of Robinson himself. They hadn't yet seen the prosecution's final blow. And when those moments arrived, they would shake the courtroom to its core. Because what happened next wasn't just testimony, it was revelation. And no one in that room was prepared for what they were about to hear. When the prosecution began calling eyewitnesses to the stand, the courtroom seemed to shift. Suddenly, it wasn't charts, DNA reports, or legal arguments. It was raw, human voices reliving a nightmare. These weren't scientists or experts speaking in clinical terms. These were ordinary people, students, parents, bystanders, who had been there on that Wednesday afternoon at Utah Valley University when the crack of a rifle tore through the air. Their testimony wasn't about probabilities or chain of custody. It was about fear, chaos, and trauma. And it hit the jury like a thunderclap. The first eyewitness was a sophomore named Megan, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. "I was sitting maybe 20 feet from the stage," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Charlie Kirk had just started talking about free speech on campuses. And then it sounded like fireworks. Just one loud bang. At first, I didn't even realize what it was. But then I saw him fall, and people started screaming." She paused, wiping her eyes, the memory too sharp to hide. "I ran. Everyone was running. People were falling, pushing. I thought I was going to die." You could hear the gasps from the gallery. The jury leaned forward. Some glanced at Robinson, others avoided his face entirely. The defense attorney rose slowly. "Megan," he said gently, "thank you for your bravery. But let me ask, did you see who fired the shot?" Her answer was quick. "No, I didn't see." And just like that, the defense began carving cracks into the emotional testimony. They knew that pain moves hearts, but facts sway verdicts. The next eyewitness was different. A young man named Daniel, a first-year student, claimed he had seen something more. "I was near the back of the crowd," he said nervously. "When the shot rang out, I looked up. I I saw someone on the rooftop. The courtroom froze. Someone on the rooftop. Could this be the direct link the prosecution needed? Can you describe the person? The prosecutor asked, almost breathless. Daniel nodded, but hesitated. It was fast, but I saw a figure. Male, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see his face. The prosecutor pushed harder. Did you recognize the man as the defendant, Tyler Robinson? Silence. Daniel's eyes darted toward Robinson, who sat still, hands folded, staring straight ahead. Finally, Daniel shook his head. No, I can't say for sure it was him. I just saw a shadow. That's all. The defense pounced. So, you cannot identify my client. You cannot say it was him on that rooftop, correct? Daniel's voice cracked. Correct. The momentum seemed to slip for the prosecution. The eyewitnesses could paint the horror, but none could paint Robinson directly into the scene. And then came the most gut-wrenching testimony, the voice of a mother. She had been in the audience with her teenage son. Her hands shook as she gripped the stand. I pulled him down when I heard the shot. I laid on top of him. I thought we were going to die right there. Her son, sitting in the gallery, wiped his eyes as she spoke. The prosecutor's questions were simple. What did you feel in that moment? Her answer broke the room. Helpless, terrified, and angry. Angry that someone could do this at a school, in front of children, in front of everyone. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Tears filled the eyes of Kirk's family. For a moment, the trial wasn't about law. It was about humanity. But once again, the defense cut through. Did you see who fired the weapon? No, she admitted, voice cracking. Each testimony followed a rhythm. Trauma, chaos, pain, followed by the defense drilling down to the same point. No one actually saw Robinson pull the trigger. And yet, the accumulation of these voices did something powerful. They created a vivid picture of what happened that day, a picture the jury could not ignore. The terror, the screams, the stampede, all of it reinforced the prosecution's narrative of premeditation and public endangerment. But then came a twist. A security guard from the university took the stand. He testified that he had been among the first to reach the rooftop after the shooting. I saw the towel. I saw the screwdriver. I saw the spot where the shooter had been positioned. The prosecutor leaned forward. And what did you conclude? The guard's answer was firm. Whoever was up there had planned this. They didn't just stumble onto that roof. They knew what they were doing. This wasn't just trauma. It was interpretation. It underscored the prosecution's case. This was deliberate, calculated, not random chaos. But perhaps the most chilling testimony came from a man sitting near the front of the rally. He recalled locking eyes with Charlie Kirk seconds before the shot. He was smiling. He was about to make a point. And then he was gone. Just like that. I'll never forget that moment. His words lingered in the courtroom like a ghost. The defense tried to dismantle each witness. They repeated the same question. Did you see Tyler Robinson? And time after time, the answer was no. But the strategy was risky. Because while the witnesses couldn't place Robinson directly at the rooftop, their testimony painted him as the faceless monster who had turned an afternoon into a nightmare. The jurors weren't just hearing facts. They were feeling the fear. And that fear, combined with the DNA evidence they'd already seen, was a powerful weapon for the prosecution. Still, the defense had scored a point. No eyewitness could conclusively identify Robinson as the shooter. The picture was painted in broad strokes, but the details, the face on the rooftop, remained blurred. So where did this leave the case? Strong evidence, overwhelming emotion, but still missing the direct link every defense attorney prays will stay missing. The prosecution knew they needed more. They needed testimony that didn't just describe fear, but placed Robinson inescapably at the center of the crime. And they believed they had it. Because the next witness wasn't just another student or bystander. The next witness was science itself. And science doesn't stutter. Science doesn't blink. Science doesn't say, I can't be sure. And when the jury heard what came next, the room would fall silent in a way no eyewitness could ever achieve. Because what the jury was about to see would change everything. Silence. It can be deafening. In a courtroom, words are expected, pleas, explanations, denials, confessions. But Tyler Robinson gave none of them. From the moment of his arrest to every day he sat at that defendant's table, he was a ghost of a man wrapped in silence. He didn't flinch when the evidence was presented. He didn't react when eyewitnesses cried on the stand. He didn't even glance at the family of Charlie Kirk, who sat just a few feet away, their grief raw and visible. He sat there like stone, arms folded, lips pressed tightly together, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Why did he remain silent? That question became almost as important as the crime itself. To the prosecution, Robinson's silence was proof of arrogance, a killer so detached he couldn't even pretend remorse. "Look at him," the lead prosecutor told the jury during one recess. "He shows no humanity, no regret, no explanation. What kind of person refuses to speak after shattering so many lives?" But the defense spun it differently. "Silence is not guilt," they argued. "Silence is a right. My client owes no one an explanation. He is not required to speak. Do not mistake silence for confession." So which was it? Cold indifference or constitutional right? Calculated strategy or broken mind? That mystery hung in the courtroom like a storm cloud, every juror silently wondering, why won't he speak? The silence made every glance at Robinson more intense. When the DNA evidence was laid bare, when scientists testified about the towel and the screwdriver, jurors turned their eyes toward him, waiting for a reaction. Would his face twitch? Would he shake his head? Would he whisper something to his lawyers? Nothing. Not a word. Not a move. It was as though he had built an impenetrable wall around himself, daring the world to try and break it down. Let's pause here and ask, how do you interpret silence? If someone accused you of murder, would you stay quiet? Would you let others speak for you, while your life hung in the balance? Or would you shout, proclaim innocence, demand to be heard? Robinson's refusal to speak became his loudest statement, and everyone was listening. Behind closed doors, whispers spread. Some speculated he was mentally unstable, incapable of understanding the gravity of his situation. Others wondered if he was playing a dangerous game, betting that his silence would create just enough doubt to save him from death row. Still others suggested something darker, that he was unrepentant, and silence was his way of showing defiance, a final insult to the people he had terrorized. Psychologists who observed the case gave their own theories. Some suspects retreat into silence as a form of control. One expert said on a nightly news panel, "They can't control the evidence, they can't control the lawyers, but they can control whether they speak. It's the last piece of power they hold." Another expert countered, "Or it could be dissociation, an inability to process reality. Silence can be the shield of the broken as well as the arrogant." Which version was Tyler Robinson? Arrogant or broken? Control or collapse? The silence became more than a mystery. It became a strategy point. The prosecution used it to fuel their demand for death. They painted Robinson as a soulless killer, incapable of remorse, beyond redemption. The defense used it to humanize him, suggesting that maybe silence was a cry for help, a sign of trauma, even evidence of mental illness that should spare him the ultimate penalty. But here's the twist. Jurors weren't told what to think about his silence. They weren't given instructions on how to interpret it. They were left to their own judgments. And that made it even more dangerous. Some jurors might see a monster. Others might see a lost boy. And neither side could predict which interpretation would win out. The media seized on it. "Silent suspect," read one headline. "Defiant or disturbed?" asked another. Every camera shot of Robinson became headline material. Was his face emotionless or simply blank? Did his stillness hide contempt or fear? Silence made him a canvas, and the world painted him in whatever colors suited their narrative. But then came the most pivotal moment of all, the opportunity for Robinson himself to take the stand. It was his chance to speak, to explain, to offer something that might tilt the scales. Everyone in the room braced for it. Would he finally break his silence? Would he confess? Would he claim innocence? When the judge asked, his lawyer rose. "The defendant will not be testifying." A gasp rippled through the gallery. No testimony. No words. The silence continued. That choice sealed something in the minds of the jury. It may not have proven guilt, but it cemented the image of Robinson as unreachable, unknowable, untouchable. In trials like this, jurors crave humanity. They look for a flicker of emotion, a crack in the mask, something to connect to. Robinson gave them nothing. But the silence wasn't just chilling, it was dangerous for him. Because into that void, the prosecution poured their story. They told the jury what his silence meant. They told them it was coldness. They told them it was indifference. And with no words from Robinson to counter it, Their story became his story. And then came the moment that would haunt the courtroom. During a break in testimony, a member of Charlie Kirk's family looked directly at Robinson, tears in their eyes, and whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Why? Just tell us why." Robinson didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't answer. That silence crushed the room. The unanswered question hung heavier than any testimony. Why? Why did he do it? Why target Charlie Kirk? Why in front of hundreds of people? The silence left the wound open, festering, gnawing at everyone's need for closure. And as the prosecution prepared to unleash their most powerful evidence yet, they knew they could use that silence like a weapon. They knew they could hammer it home again and again. This man will not speak, will not explain, will not repent. And that is why he deserves the ultimate punishment. But the defense had one final card to play, one last attempt to turn silence into something sympathetic. They whispered to the jury, "Maybe the silence means he's broken. Maybe the silence means he's not in his right mind. Maybe the silence means he doesn't deserve death." Two competing interpretations. One man sitting still, and a jury caught in the middle. But soon, the silence would be shattered, not by Robinson, but by the prosecution. Because what they were about to reveal wasn't just evidence. It was a blow so devastating that even Robinson's wall of silence couldn't protect him. And when that moment came, it would shake the courtroom to its very core. There are moments in trials where the story steps outside the courtroom, where the walls that are supposed to contain the drama, the evidence, and the arguments suddenly give way to the larger world. That moment came when Utah Governor Spencer Cox broke the usual silence of politics in ongoing trials and delivered a statement that shook both the court of law and the court of public opinion. It's rare, almost unheard of, for a sitting governor to weigh in so directly during an active case. Judges don't like it. Defense attorneys despise it. Prosecutors tread carefully around it. But when Spencer Cox stepped before the cameras, his words weren't measured or vague. They were sharp, deliberate, and unforgettable. "The suspect is not cooperating," he said firmly. "He has not confessed. He refuses to engage with investigators." That silence is not helping him, nor is it helping the people of Utah understand why this tragedy occurred. With that statement, the governor did more than just inform. He inflamed. He took the already tense narrative of Tyler Robinson's silence and threw gasoline on it. And in doing so, he raised the stakes for everyone. Why did this matter so much? Because politics and justice rarely exist in separate worlds. Charlie Kirk wasn't just a random victim. He was a national figure, co-founder of Turning Point USA, a man known for sparking heated debates on campuses across the country. His death wasn't just a crime. It was a political earthquake. And when politics enters the courtroom, the pressure skyrockets. For the prosecution, the governor's words were a gift. They reinforced their argument that Robinson was cold, unrepentant, and undeserving of mercy. If even the highest political figure in Utah was publicly condemning his silence, then surely the jury could see it too. For the defense, however, it was a nightmare. They argued furiously that the governor's statement could prejudice the jury, that it risked making Robinson's silence look like guilt instead of a legal right. They even filed a motion requesting the judge issue instructions reminding jurors to ignore outside commentary. The motion was granted, but the damage was done. Once words like that enter the public arena, they can't be unsaid. But let's pause here. Why would a governor risk wading into such dangerous waters? Some speculated it was pressure from the public. Protests and vigils had erupted across Utah, demanding answers, demanding justice, demanding something to fill the void left by Charlie Kirk's assassination. Others believed it was political calculation, Cox aligning himself with outrage, showing leadership by taking a firm stand. And still others suggested something darker, that the governor's office may have been briefed on evidence so explosive, so irrefutable, that he felt safe making such a bold declaration. What do you think? Was it leadership, opportunism, or certainty? The effect in the courtroom was immediate. Reporters swarmed, writing headlines like, "Governor slams silent suspect." Television anchors replayed his statement on loop. Jurors, though told to ignore it, undoubtedly felt the ripple. How could they not? The state's most powerful elected official had just told the world that Tyler Robinson's silence was damning. And here's the irony. Robinson's silence, already a haunting presence in the trial, now became the central battlefield. The prosecution painted it as proof of arrogance. The defense painted it as his right. The governor painted it